A trained artillery officer, someone who never missed his target, was sent into an infantry assault with no training and no reason. A leaked chat message from a Russian general explains exactly why. Collect the money, don't push it too far, then delete this message. This is a theory about why Russia keeps burning its own best soldiers, and it's worth being honest about where the evidence is solid and where it isn't. Today's video lays out an argument, not a proven fact, that corruption inside the Russian military isn't just a failure Moscow can't fix, but something the system tolerates, and maybe even needs. I'll flag clearly which parts are documented and which parts are informed speculation, because that distinction actually matters here. This is exactly the kind of story where blending the two together does a disservice to both the strength of the documented evidence and the honest uncertainty around the bigger theory it points toward. Welcome back. Let's start with what's actually documented. Investigative reporting from RFE, RL, and PBS has tracked a pattern that Russian soldiers themselves describe as protection money extortion, run by their own commanders. Want a safer posting in the rear? Pay. Want a medical discharge? Pay. Want to avoid being sent into an assault? Pay. Documented complaints from soldiers about this, not from relatives, not from journalists, from soldiers themselves, numbered close to 12,000 over a 6-month stretch. A leaked message from a Russian general to the officer replacing him as division commander put the culture in writing. Collect money for yourself, don't overdo it, and delete this message afterward. That's not an interpretation. That's what a serving general apparently told his own successor. It's also worth noting what this system replaced: a nominally formal chain of command where promotion, transfer, and medical discharge were supposed to be governed by regulation and medical assessment, not by who could pay the largest bribe fastest. The gap between those two systems, the one on paper and the one soldiers actually describe living under, is itself part of the story. Now here's where documented fact becomes something closer to a working theory, and I want to be upfront about that shift. The claim is that when a commander doesn't like a soldier, in practice that usually means one of two things: the soldier didn't pay, or the soldier spoke up about something the commander wanted kept quiet. There are documented cases of soldiers who reported drug trafficking or corruption in their unit and were assigned an assault mission shortly afterward, a one-way ticket as soldiers themselves describe it. Estonian security researcher Erkki Kort has written about how deeply organized crime has embedded itself in Russian units specifically, with criminal networks controlling logistics through extortion, torture, and drug trafficking, and warns that these networks pose a real post-war security risk for Russia's European neighbors once heavily armed veterans start moving outward. Kort's specific point is worth repeating carefully. This isn't primarily about veterans committing crimes after they come home, which gets most of the attention, but about organized criminal structures already controlling entire units from the inside while the war is still being fought, which is a much harder problem to eventually dismantle once the fighting stops. So here's the actual argument, and it's worth stating plainly as an argument rather than a fact. This dysfunction may not be a bug Putin's system is failing to fix. It may be a feature the system is actively using. The logic runs like this: Putin's greatest fear, going back years, isn't Ukraine or NATO. According to this reading, it's his own military turning against him the way armies have turned against Russian leadership before, most vividly in 1917, and in a smaller but more immediate way, in Wagner founder Yevgeny Prigozhin's march toward Moscow in June 2023. Prigozhin's mutiny demonstrated exactly what actually threatens a system like Putin's: a cohesive structure with a popular leader, its own money, its own logistics, and genuine group loyalty. Criminal networks are structurally the opposite of that. They're fragmented, they compete against each other for territory and cuts, and every participant holds compromising material on every other participant. A protection racket doesn't march on Moscow. Its members would have to agree first on how to split what happens next, and criminal networks are specifically bad at that kind of unified action. It's worth remembering just how close Prigozhin actually got before that mutiny collapsed, largely on its own terms rather than through any decisive government response. A fact that would only sharpen this kind of fear inside the Kremlin rather than ease it, since the lesson learned wasn't that the system worked, it was that it worked by luck. If soldiers spend their energy hating their own commanding officer more than the enemy, and commanders spend their energy distrusting the next commander over, the theory goes, no future Prigozhin-style figure can assemble the kind of loyal following that made 2023 dangerous. divide and rule applied to your own army in the middle of an active war. It's a genuinely dark theory, and one Ukrainian and Western analysts increasingly discuss, even though it remains by its nature extremely difficult to prove from outside the system. You cannot subpoena the Kremlin's internal reasoning. What you can observe is a pattern of outcomes that would make sense if the theory is true. There's a grim second-order consequence to this pattern worth naming directly, even if it belongs mostly to court's warning rather than to hard documentation. A system built to prevent any veteran from returning home with strong bonds to fellow soldiers is also, almost by accident, a system that produces isolated, traumatized men with combat skills and no network of trust to reintegrate into. Criminal groups already forming around returning veterans, as court describes them, aren't stepping into a vacuum the war created by chance. They're stepping into exactly the kind of vacuum this specific command culture tends to leave behind. There is one more thread that fits the same pattern without requiring you to accept the whole theory. Soldiers who publicly criticize the meatwave tactics or command failures have, in multiple documented cases, been punished specifically by being sent to the front. A blogger who lost credibility after publicly criticizing the war had his phone confiscated with a broken leg and was sent on a punitive assault. He hasn't posted since. A Frontline veteran and blogger who published casualty estimates for the Battle of Avdiivka was pressured to delete the post, faced a harassment campaign, and took his own life shortly after. Whether or not you accept the broader theory about deliberate power preservation, the pattern of punishing criticism with Frontline assignment is documented across multiple separate cases, from separate bloggers in separate regions, which is exactly the kind of repetition that turns an isolated incident into something that looks a lot more like policy, even without a written order anyone has managed to produce. None of this requires Putin to have personally designed a master plan. Systems can produce outcomes that serve a leader's interests without anyone writing that intention down anywhere. What's genuinely verifiable is this. Soldiers report extortion by the thousands. A general's own words describe collecting money as standard practice. Criticism of Frontline tactics has repeatedly been answered with Frontline punishment, and the resulting structure happens to be one that a paranoid leadership would have every reason to prefer over a cohesive, loyal, well-led army that might one day decide it doesn't need him anymore. It's the difference between proving intent and observing a pattern robust enough that intent becomes almost beside the point. A system doesn't need a conscious architect if the incentives inside it consistently reward exactly the behavior that keeps it fragmented, distrustful, and incapable of organizing against the person at the top. The artillery officer who never missed still ended up in the infantry. The general's message told his successor exactly how the system was supposed to work, and whether that's a broken system Moscow can't fix or a broken system Moscow specifically doesn't want fixed, is a question with a body count attached either way. One that keeps growing regardless of which answer turns out to be true, and one that will likely only be settled, if it ever is, by whoever eventually gets access to files the Kremlin has no intention of ever opening voluntarily.